Sometimes the most broken souls find each other when the world turns its back on both. We all know what it feels like to be wounded and unwanted, limping through life while others look away. At the trading post of Skallavik, a hurt wolf wandered between the market stalls. The animal was bloodied and starving. Everyone wanted it gone. Warriors called for its death. Children ran in fear. For 3 days no one showed it kindness. Then came Jorik the Ashborn, a quiet giant of a man. While others saw danger, he saw pain. He knelt down and offered the wolf water from his own bowl. The wolf drank. When Jorik looked closer at its wounds, he found something that changed everything. These weren't battle scars from other animals. They were burn marks made by human hands. Someone had tortured this creature. As the days passed, the wolf began following Jorik everywhere. When bandits attacked the trading post, it was the wolf who saved a child's life. But what ancient secret would this bond between man and beast reveal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and Jorik the Ashborn stood at the edge of Skallavik's wooden docks, watching the sun paint the water in shades of copper and gold. At 43 winters, he had seen enough dawns to know that each one carried its own promise, though he had long ago stopped expecting them to be kept. His massive frame cast a shadow that stretched back toward the trading post, where the day's commerce was already stirring to life. Skallavik was not like the great halls of Jarls or the fortified settlements that dotted the coastline. It existed in the spaces between kingdoms, a neutral ground where Norse traders, Saxon merchants, and even the occasional Slavic wanderer could conduct business without the weight of old feuds pressing down upon their shoulders. The settlement had grown around a natural harbour, protected from the worst of the North Sea's fury by a crescent of black stone cliffs. Wooden buildings climbed the hillside in terraced rows, their timber darkened by salt spray and countless seasons. The trading post itself occupied the heart of the settlement, a sprawling collection of interconnected buildings that housed everything from blacksmith forges to grain stores. The main hall could accommodate 300 souls when the great trading gatherings occurred each summer and autumn. But even in the quieter months like this one, when only resident traders and their families remained, the post hummed with activity. The scent of wood smoke mixed with the sharper tang of iron being worked, the sweet aroma of honeyed mead, and the earthy smell of livestock penned behind the main buildings. Jorik had arrived at Skallavik 7 years ago, carrying nothing but his sword, a leather satchel of possessions, and a silence that seemed to weigh more than both. He had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of the settlement and taken work where he could find it loading ships, moving cargo, sometimes serving as protection for merchants who ventured into less peaceful territories. His size alone was often enough to deter trouble, and when it was not, his skill with a blade settled matters quickly and quietly. The other residents had learned to read the careful boundaries he maintained. Jorik was reliable, honest in his dealings, and would lend his strength to any task that needed doing. But he did not speak of his past, did not join the evening gatherings where men shared stories and bragged of their accomplishments. When pressed for tales of his own, he would simply say that some stories were better left buried, and something in his grey eyes suggested that wisdom lay in not digging them up. Astrid Ironsdottir, who managed the post's largest inn, had taken to leaving meals outside his door during his first winter, when she noticed he ate little and spoke to no one. She was a woman of 50-some years, widowed young, but possessed of the kind of practical strength that kept communities alive through hard seasons. Her auburn hair had gone silver at the temples, and her green eyes missed little of what transpired in her domain. "You eat like a sparrow and brood like a raven," she had told him one morning, appearing at his door with a steaming bowl of mutton stew. "Whatever darkness you carry, it will not be lightened by starving yourself." Jorik had accepted the food with a nod of gratitude, and though he never spoke of what had brought him to Skallavik, Astrid seemed to understand that his silence was not rudeness, but necessity. Over the years, their exchanges had grown into something resembling friendship, built on shared tasks and comfortable quiet rather than words. Magnus the smith was another who had welcomed Jorik's presence, though for more practical reasons. The big man's strength was useful in the forge, and he could swing a hammer with precision that came from years of wielding heavier weapons. Magnus was a thick-built man of middle years, his beard streaked with premature white from working so close to the forge fires. His hands bore the countless small scars that marked a life spent shaping metal, and his reputation for quality work drew customers from settlements days away. "You have the hands of a warrior," Magnus had observed during one of their early sessions together, "but you work like a man seeking peace." Jorik had simply continued his rhythmic hammering, shaping a piece of iron into a horseshoe with careful, measured strikes. "Perhaps peace is what warriors seek most," he had replied, and Magnus had nodded as if this explanation satisfied him completely. Young Erik Thornson, barely 16 winters and eager to prove himself worthy of the trader's life his father had planned for him, often sought Jorik's company during the evening hours. The boy had an endless appetite for stories and seemed to believe that if he asked enough questions in enough different ways, he might eventually coax tales of adventure from the giant's lips. "My father says you carry yourself like a man who has seen battles," Erik had said one evening as they sat on the docks, watching fishing boats return with the day's catch. "He says warriors have a way of moving that marks them forever." Jorik had been quiet for so long that Erik began to think he would receive no answer. Finally, the older man spoke, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Your father is wise, but he is also wise enough to know that not all battles are worth remembering, and not all stories are worth telling." Erik had pressed him no further, perhaps sensing that some doors, once closed, were meant to remain that way. The wounded wolf had appeared on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, limping into the trading post as if drawn by some invisible thread. At first, the animal had seemed like any other scavenger, drawn by the scent of food and the promise of scraps. But there was something different about this creature, something that made even the bravest men step aside when it passed. It was not an especially large wolf, though its frame suggested it had once been well-fed and powerful. Now, malnutrition had carved hollows in its flanks, and its grey-brown coat was matted with dried blood and dirt. One rear leg dragged slightly, and a long gash across its muzzle had healed poorly, leaving a permanent snarl carved into its features. But it was the animal's eyes that truly unnerved those who saw it, yellow orbs that held not the wild emptiness of a beast, but something that looked disturbingly like human suffering. The wolf had positioned itself near the main well, in the center of the trading post's courtyard, close enough to the daily bustle to benefit from dropped food and spilled drink, but far enough from the buildings to avoid being cornered. When anyone approached too closely, it would bare its teeth and emit a low growl that seemed to vibrate in the bones of those who heard it. Children fled when it appeared, women clutched their skirts and hurried past. Even the settlement's dogs seemed to sense something wrong about the creature and gave it a wide berth. Gunnar the Bold, a merchant who specialized in weapons and considered himself something of a warrior, had suggested killing the animal on its second day. "A wounded wolf is a dangerous wolf," he had declared to anyone who would listen. "It will attack someone eventually, mark my words. Best to put it down before it causes trouble." Several others had nodded agreement, but no one had volunteered to be the one to approach the creature. There was something about its stillness, the way it watched everything with those two intelligent eyes, that suggested killing it would not be as simple as Gunnar imagined. Old Bjorn, who had been trading at Skallavik longer than anyone could remember, had offered a different perspective. "In my grandfather's time, they would have said such an animal was touched by the gods," he had mused, stroking his white beard thoughtfully. "Not all divine attention is blessing, mind you, but it is never wise to act hastily against something you do not understand." And so the wolf had remained, surviving on scraps and rainwater, growing thinner and more desperate with each passing day. It moved like a ghost through the settlement, appearing and disappearing with an uncanny ability to avoid direct confrontation. Some claimed they had seen it watching them from the shadows, its yellow eyes reflecting torchlight like twin flames. Others insisted it was merely a sick animal, driven by hunger and pain to behavior that seemed more unsettling than it truly was. It was on the third morning of the wolf's presence that Jorik the Ashborn knelt in the mud beside the well and offered water from his own drinking bowl. The wooden bowl trembled slightly in Jorik's massive hands as he lowered it toward the wolf. Fresh water from the well caught the morning light, creating ripples that danced across the surface like tiny silver flames. Around the courtyard, the usual bustle of daily commerce had fallen silent. Merchants paused in their bargaining, children stopped their games, and even the ever-present seabirds seemed to hold their breath. The wolf's yellow eyes fixed on Jorik's face with an intensity that made his skin prickle. This close, he could see the full extent of the creature's suffering. The matted fur revealed patches of pink, scarred skin beneath. The injured leg was swollen at the joint, suggesting old damage that had never properly healed. But it was the burn marks that made Jorik's jaw tighten with barely contained anger. Someone had taken heated metal to this animal's flesh. The marks were too precise, too deliberate to be accidental. They formed patterns along the wolf's flanks and shoulders, not the random scarring of a forge accident or cooking fire, but the methodical work of someone who had taken pleasure in causing pain. Jorik recognized the signs because he had seen such cruelty before, in darker places during darker times he preferred not to remember. The wolf's nostrils flared as it caught Jorik's scent. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither man nor beast moved. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the wolf lowered its head toward the offered bowl. Its pink tongue emerged, and it began to drink with careful, measured laps. Jorik remained perfectly still, feeling the eyes of the entire trading post upon them. The wolf drank for nearly a full minute, and when it finally raised its head, water still dripping from its muzzle, something had changed in its expression. The constant snarl had softened slightly, and though the yellow eyes remained wary, they no longer held quite the same desperate ferocity. "Well, I'll be cursed by Thor's hammer," whispered Magnus from somewhere behind Jorik. The beast didn't take his hand off. Astrid's voice carried clearly across the courtyard. "Jorik has gentle hands. Animals sense such things." But Jorik knew it was more than that. As he looked into the wolf's eyes, he saw something that reminded him powerfully of his own reflection in still water, the haunted gaze of a creature that had endured more than it should have, that had survived when survival seemed impossible, and that had learned to trust nothing and no one. It was the look of a being that had been broken and had somehow kept breathing anyway. The wolf stepped back from the empty bowl but did not retreat. Instead, it settled onto its haunches, favoring the injured leg, and continued to study Jorik with those unsettling eyes. The giant remained kneeling in the mud, making no sudden movements, offering no threat. "What do you see when you look at me?" Jorik asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see the same darkness I carry? The same scars that never quite heal?" The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and its head tilted slightly to one side, as if considering the question seriously. Then, in a movement that shocked every observer, the animal took a tentative step forward and lowered its head to sniff Jorik's outstretched hand. Young Eric gasped audibly from his position near the grain storehouse. Gunnar the Bold muttered something about madness and touched the iron hammer pendant at his throat. But old Bjorn nodded slowly, as if this development confirmed some long-held suspicion. The wolf's nose was cold and wet against Jorik's palm. The animal's breathing was shallow, laboured, suggesting internal injuries to match the visible ones. But there was no aggression in its posture now, only a bone-deep weariness that Jorik understood all too well. "You've travelled a long way to find this place," Jorik continued in the same soft tone, "and you're hurt worse than you're letting them see, aren't you?" As if in response to his words, the wolf's front legs buckled slightly, and it had to shift its weight to keep from falling. Jorik moved instinctively to steady the animal, his large hand coming to rest against its shoulder. The wolf tensed, but did not pull away, and Jorik felt the rapid flutter of its heartbeat beneath the matted fur. That was when he discovered the collar. Hidden beneath the wolf's thick neck fur, almost invisible beneath layers of dirt and dried blood, was a band of iron. Jorik's fingers found the metal and traced its edges, feeling the wolf flinch but not resist. The collar was old, forged by someone with considerable skill, and it bore engravings that made Jorik's blood run cold. He had seen such markings before, long ago, in a place he had tried to forget. They were runes of binding, symbols used by those who practiced the darker aspects of the old magic. But more than that, carved into the iron in letters so small they were almost invisible, was a name: Fenris, the wolf of legend, the beast that would one day devour Odin himself at the world's ending. Jorik's hand stilled on the animal's neck as the implications crashed over him like a cold wave. This was no ordinary wolf that had wandered into Skallavik seeking food and shelter. This was something far more significant, something that connected to myths and powers that most men believed were safely buried in the distant past. But as he looked into the wolf's eyes again, he saw not the monster of children's stories, but a creature in pain, a being that had been tortured and tormented and had somehow escaped its captors to seek sanctuary in this remote trading post. Whatever this wolf truly was, whatever power it might possess, right now it was simply another wounded soul in need of help. "Fenris," Jorik whispered, and the wolf's ears pricked forward at the sound of its name. "What have they done to you?" The wolf, Fenris, made a sound that was not quite a whimper, not quite a growl. It pressed its head against Jorik's palm, and in that gesture the giant felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders like a familiar cloak. He had thought his days of bearing such burdens were behind him, that he had found peace in the simple life of Skallavik. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Standing slowly, careful not to startle the injured animal, Jorik looked around the courtyard at the faces of his neighbors. Their expressions ranged from amazement to fear to suspicion, but all of them were focused on him and the wolf with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "The animal is hurt," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "I'm going to see what I can do to help it." Gunnar stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "Jorik, you don't understand what you're dealing with. That's no ordinary wolf. Look at its eyes, man. There's something unnatural about this creature." "Unnatural or not," Jorik replied, gently scratching behind Fenris's ears. "It's suffering, and I've never been one to turn away from suffering when I have the power to ease it." Astrid moved closer, her practical eyes taking in the wolf's condition with the same efficiency she applied to evaluating livestock. "It will need food, clean water, and a place to rest safely. My inn has an unused storage room behind the kitchens. It would be quiet there, away from the crowds." "I cannot ask you to take such a risk," Jorik began, but Astrid waved off his protest. "You're not asking, I'm offering. Besides, if this wolf truly is what some of the older stories claim, it might be wise to show it kindness rather than cruelty." Old Bjorn approached with careful steps, his rheumy eyes fixed on the iron collar partially visible around Fenris's neck. "That metalwork is older than anything forged in these lands for generations," he observed quietly. "And those markings I've seen there like only once before, in my youth, when raiders from the far north brought strange artifacts to trade." Jorik felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of raiders?" "The kind that served darker powers than most men dare to imagine," Bjorn replied. "The kind that disappeared entirely 40 winters ago, as if the earth had swallowed them whole." Fenris pressed closer against Jorik's leg, and the giant made his decision. Whatever forces had brought this creature to Skallavik, whatever ancient powers might be stirring in the wider world, his immediate duty was clear. He would care for this wounded animal and hope that in doing so he might find some measure of redemption for his own dark past. But even as he began planning for Fenris's care, Jorik could not shake the feeling that this moment marked the end of his peaceful exile and the beginning of something far more dangerous. The storage room behind Astrid's kitchen smelled of dried herbs and old wood, a combination that seemed to calm Fenris as Jorik settled him onto a bed of clean straw. The wolf had followed them without resistance, though his injured leg made the short journey painful to witness. Each step brought a barely audible whimper, and by the time they reached the makeshift sanctuary, Fenris was trembling with exhaustion. "I'll heat water for cleaning his wounds," Astrid said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "And I have some healing salves that Magnus's wife makes. They work well on injured livestock." Jorik knelt beside Fenris, whose breathing had become increasingly labored. Up close, away from the crowd's watchful eyes, he could examine the full extent of the damage. The burn marks were worse than he had initially thought, deliberate patterns that spoke of systematic torture extending over days or perhaps weeks. Someone had taken great care to inflict maximum pain while keeping the creature alive. "Who did this to you?" Jorik whispered, gently touching an unmarked patch of fur. "And why?" Fenris's yellow eyes found his, and for a moment Jorik could have sworn he saw intelligence there that went far beyond animal instinct. The wolf's lips moved slightly, almost as if trying to form words, before settling into what might have been a sigh of relief. The iron collar proved even more troubling upon closer inspection. The runes carved into its surface were not merely decorative, they pulsed with a faint, cold light that made Jorik's fingers sting when he touched them. These were binding spells of the most potent kind, designed not just to restrain, but to torment. The metal itself was black iron, forged with techniques that had been forbidden in most civilized lands for generations. "This has to come off," Jorik muttered, running his fingers along the collar's edge, searching for a clasp or lock. But the iron formed a complete circle with no visible means of opening. The metal had been shaped around Fenris's neck, likely while the wolf was unconscious or magically restrained. Astrid returned with a basin of warm water and clean cloths, setting them down carefully beside the straw bed. "Magnus is gathering his tools," she reported quietly. "He thinks he might be able to cut through the collar, but it will be dangerous work. One slip and—" She didn't finish the sentence. They all understood the risks involved in trying to remove magical bindings from around the neck of a creature whose true nature remained largely unknown. Fenris struggled to lift his head as Astrid began cleaning the worst of the wounds. The wolf bore her ministrations with remarkable patience, only flinching when the cloth encountered particularly tender areas. But as she worked, she made small sounds of distress at what she discovered. "Jorik," she said softly, pausing in her work, "these burns, they're not random. Look at the pattern." Following her guidance, Jorik traced the lines of scarred flesh with his eyes. What had appeared to be random cruelty resolved itself into deliberate design. The burn marks formed symbols, runes of pain and binding that complemented those on the iron collar. Someone had been attempting to transform Fenris into something else, to bind not just his body, but his very essence. "Blood magic," Jorik said grimly. Someone was trying to control him completely. The implications sent a chill through the small room. In Jorik's experience, those who practiced such arts rarely worked alone, and they never gave up their prizes willingly. If Fenris had escaped from such captors, they would certainly come looking for him. Magnus arrived with his tools just as the afternoon light began to fade. The smith had brought his finest files and a small hammer designed for delicate work, along with a leather muzzle and several lengths of rope. "If this goes wrong," he said without preamble, "the wolf could turn on us. I've seen animals panic when they feel trapped." Jorik looked down at Fenris, who seemed to understand the conversation despite the human speech. The wolf's eyes moved from face to face, settling finally on Jorik with an expression that seemed almost pleading. We won't use the muzzle, Jorik decided. If he wanted to hurt us, he could have done so already. Haven't you, old friend? Fenris made a sound that might have been agreement, or perhaps simply exhaustion. But when Magnus positioned himself carefully and began to work on the collar, the wolf remained perfectly still, though his body tensed with each scrape of metal against metal. The work proved more difficult than expected. The collar had been forged with techniques that made the iron harder than natural, and the runes seemed to resist Magnus's efforts. Twice, the smith had to stop and resharpen his tools. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "It's like trying to cut through a mountain," Magnus muttered. This metal was worked with more than just fire and hammer, but slowly, painstakingly, he made progress. A thin line appeared in the collar's surface, deepening with each careful stroke. The rune's cold light began to flicker, like candle flames in a strong wind. It was then that the first messenger arrived. Young Eric burst through the door without knocking, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Jorik, strangers at the gates. 3 men in dark cloaks, riding horses that don't look natural. They're asking about a wolf." The file slipped in Magnus's hand, and Fenris yelped as the tools scraped against his neck. Blood welled from a small cut, but the wolf's eyes remained fixed on Jorik, who felt his own blood turn to ice. "How long until they reach the inn?" he asked, his voice calm despite the urgency he felt. "They're speaking with the gate guards now. Maybe 10 minutes, perhaps less." Astrid stood quickly, her practical mind already working on solutions. "The cellar. It connects to the old tunnels that run beneath the settlement. We can hide him there until—" "No." Jorik's voice cut through her words with quiet authority. "Running will only confirm their suspicions, and Fenris is in no condition to flee." He looked down at the wolf, whose breathing had become even more labored at the mention of the strangers. Whatever these men represented, Fenris knew them and feared them. Magnus set down his tools with shaking hands. "Jorik, if these are the people who did this to him, they're not going to be reasoned with. Dark magic leaves its mark on those who practice it." "Then we'll have to be ready for them," Jorik replied, his mind already shifting into patterns of thought he had hoped never to use again. "Magnus, how close are you to cutting through?" "Perhaps halfway. Another hour of careful work, maybe 2. We don't have that long." Jorik stood, his massive frame seeming to fill the small room. "Astrid, can you make excuses about the wolf? Say it wandered off, or that you drove it away. I can try, but if they have any skill at reading truth, they'll know I'm lying." Fenris struggled to his feet, swaying slightly but managing to stand. His yellow eyes met Jorik's, and in them the giant saw determination that matched his own. The wolf might be injured, but he was not helpless. "Then we make our stand here," Jorik said quietly. "Whatever they want with Fenris, they'll have to go through us to get it." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by an unnatural silence that seemed to muffle the usual evening sounds of the settlement. The 3 strangers who dismounted in front of Astrid's inn looked like shadows given human form. Their dark cloaks hung motionless, despite the evening breeze that stirred everything else in the courtyard. Their horses stood unnaturally still, breath steaming in the cool air but making no sound. No stamping of hooves or snorting that normal animals would display after a long ride. Jorik watched them through the small window of the storage room, his warrior's instincts cataloguing every detail. The leader was tall and thin, his face hidden deep within his hood, but pale hands emerged from his sleeves that seemed to glow with their own cold light. The other 2 flanked him like bodyguards, their postures alert and predatory. "Astrid," Jorik said quietly, "go out and greet them normally. You're the innkeeper, it's natural for you to welcome travelers. But don't volunteer any information." She nodded, smoothing her apron and checking her appearance in the small mirror beside the door. Years of dealing with difficult customers had taught her to maintain composure under pressure, but Jorik could see the tension in her shoulders as she prepared to face whatever these men represented. Fenris had pressed himself against the far wall, his yellow eyes never leaving the window. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, so quiet it was more vibration than sound. The wolf's reaction confirmed what Jorik already suspected. These were the ones responsible for his suffering. Magnus gathered his tools with careful movements, wrapping them in leather to muffle any sound. "If fighting starts," he whispered, "I'll be more use with a hammer than these files." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Jorik replied, though his hand instinctively moved to rest on the pommel of his sword. He had hoped those days were behind him, but some lessons, once learned, were never truly forgotten. Through the window, they watched Astrid emerge from the inn's main entrance, her smile bright and welcoming despite the circumstances. "Good evening, travellers. Welcome to Skallavik. Are you seeking lodging for the night?" The leader's voice carried clearly across the courtyard, though it seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than a human throat should allow. "We seek information, not comfort. A beast has been taken from us, a wolf of unusual appearance. We have reason to believe it may have found its way to this settlement." Astrid's laugh was perfectly pitched, carrying just the right note of surprise and mild amusement. "A wolf? Oh, yes. There was one hanging about the well yesterday. Nasty-looking thing, half-starved and mean as a viper. We drove it off this morning when it started frightening the children." "Drove it off?" The stranger's head tilted slightly, and Jorik caught a glimpse of what might have been eyes beneath the hood, pale points of light that seemed to pierce through the gathering darkness. How exactly was this accomplished? Threw stones and shouted mostly. It limped away toward the northern woods. Haven't seen hide nor hair of it since, and good riddance too. One of the flanking figures stepped forward, and Jorik's blood chilled as he saw the man's face clearly for the first time. The skin was grey and mottled, marked with the same kind of ritual scarring that covered Fenris. These weren't just practitioners of dark magic, they were its victims as well, transformed by their own arts into something barely human. "May we search your establishment?" the transformed creature asked, its voice carrying the inflection of a polite request wrapped around a clear threat. Astrid's smile never wavered, though Jorik saw her hands clench slightly at her sides. "Of course, though I warn you there's not much to see, just guest rooms and storage mostly, nothing that would interest a wolf." In the storage room, Fenris had begun to shake. Not with fear, Jorik realized, but with rage. The wolf's lips pulled back to reveal teeth that seemed longer and sharper than they had appeared before. Whatever these creatures had done to him, the memory of it burned in him like poison. "Easy," Jorik whispered, placing a calming hand on Fenris's head. "Not yet. Let them come to us." The strangers moved through the inn with purpose, their footsteps echoing in the common room as they conducted their search. Jorik heard doors opening and closing, the sound of furniture being moved, the thud of heavy boots on wooden floors. They were thorough, but not destructive, clearly confident in their ability to handle whatever they might find. When the footsteps approached the kitchen area, Magnus raised his hammer and positioned himself beside the door. Jorik drew his sword partway from its scabbard, the familiar weight of the weapon bringing back memories he had tried to bury. But it was Fenris who surprised them both. The wolf moved to stand directly in front of the door, his injured leg forgotten, his entire body radiating a power that made the air itself seem to thicken. The iron collar around his neck began to glow with that same cold light, but now it seemed to be fighting against something rather than containing it. The footsteps stopped, just outside the storage room door. "This room smells different," came a voice, muffled by the wood but clearly inhuman. "There has been an injured animal here recently." Astrid's response was immediate and believable. "Oh, that. We keep the medical supplies for sick livestock in there. Had a lame horse last week that needed tending." "I see." A pause, then the sound of a hand trying the door handle. "Locked?" "Storage rooms usually are. Don't want guests helping themselves to supplies meant for emergencies." But the door handle turned anyway, the lock yielding to whatever force the stranger applied to it. The door swung open, and pale light from the corridor spilled into the storage room. The stranger who entered was the leader, his hood now thrown back to reveal a face that might once have been human. His skin was white as bone, marked with intricate scars that formed patterns similar to those burned into Fenris's flesh. His eyes were pools of silver light that seemed to swallow rather than reflect illumination. He looked directly at Fenris, who had not moved from his position in the center of the room. "There you are, my beautiful creation. We have missed you terribly." Fenris snarled, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The iron collar flared brighter, but cracks had begun to appear in its surface where Magnus had been working. "You will come with us now," the creature continued, seemingly unconcerned by the wolf's obvious hostility. "Your punishment for fleeing will be educational." That was when Jorik stepped into the light, his sword fully drawn, his massive frame filling the doorway behind the intruder. "I think not." The creature turned slowly, its silver eyes taking in Jorik's appearance with calculating interest. "Ah, the famous Jorik the Ashborn. I wondered if we might encounter you here." The words hit Jorik like physical blows. These beings knew who he was, knew his name and reputation from the life he had tried to leave behind, which meant they also knew what he was capable of when pushed to violence. "You know me," Jorik said quietly. "Then you know what will happen if you try to take the wolf." The creature smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. "Indeed I do, but I wonder if you know what you're truly protecting, old friend." The creature's smile widened as Jorik's grip tightened on his sword. "You protect the wolf that will devour gods, Ashborn. Do you understand the implications of your choice?" Jorik's mind raced as fragments of old stories and half-forgotten prophecies crashed together in his thoughts. Fenris, the wolf, bound by the gods themselves because of what he was destined to become. The creature that would break free at Ragnarok and consume Odin in the final battle. But looking at the injured animal beside him, Jorik saw not a cosmic threat, but a tortured being seeking sanctuary. "I understand that you tortured an innocent creature," Jorik replied, his voice deadly calm. "That's enough for me." The transformed sorcerer laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Innocent? You know nothing of what this beast truly is. We did not capture him for sport, Ashborn. We were hired by those far wiser than ourselves to ensure he could not fulfill his destiny." Behind the leader, the other two creatures had spread out to block the only exit. Their pale eyes reflected the strange light emanating from Fenris's collar, and Jorik could see that their transformations had progressed further than their leaders. Whatever process had changed them was consuming them slowly but inevitably. Magnus stepped up beside Jorik, his hammer held ready. "Hired by whom?" the smith demanded. "By those who remember the old prophecies and fear their fulfillment," the creature answered. "By men who understand that some prices are worth paying to prevent the end of all things." Fenris made a sound that was part growl, part whimper. The iron collar around his neck was glowing so brightly now that it cast harsh shadows on the storage room walls. Where Magnus had been filing away at the metal, steam began to rise, as if the collar was fighting against its own destruction. Astrid appeared in the doorway behind the intruders, her face pale but determined. In her hands, she carried a heavy iron poker from the kitchen fire, its tip glowing red-hot. "Perhaps you gentlemen would prefer to continue this conversation outside, away from my establishment." The leader turned his attention to her with predatory interest. "Ah, the brave innkeeper. Tell me, woman, do you know the stories of what happens to those who interfere with the work of the bone weavers?" "I know what happens to unwelcome guests who threaten my friends," Astrid replied, raising the poker. "They find themselves in need of new accommodations." The creature laughed again, but there was less humor in it this time. "Your courage is admirable but misplaced. This matter involves powers beyond your understanding." That was when Fenris acted. The wolf lunged forward with speed that belied his injuries, his teeth finding the collar around his own neck. There was a flash of brilliant white light, a sound like thunder, and suddenly the storage room was filled with the acrid smell of burning metal. The collar shattered, its pieces falling to the floor like broken stars. The change in Fenris was immediate and startling. His injured legs straightened, his breathing deepened, and his yellow eyes blazed with an inner fire that seemed to push back the darkness itself. He was still a wolf, still bore the scars of his torment, but there was something ancient and terrible in his bearing now that had been suppressed by the magical bonds. The lead creature hissed in what might have been anger or fear. Impossible. Those bindings were crafted by masters of the art. They should have held until... Until what? Jorik interrupted, his sword now pointed directly at the being's throat. Until you completed whatever abomination you were working on him? But the creature was no longer looking at Jorik. His silver eyes were fixed on Fenris, who had begun to change further. The wolf's form seemed to ripple, as if seen through water, and for brief moments something else flickered in his place, something larger, more terrible, with eyes like dying stars. "The prophesied time approaches sooner than we calculated," the creature whispered. "The bonds weakened by proximity to the Ashborn's own darkness." Jorik felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? You think your exile here was coincidence?" The creature's attention returned to Jorik with malicious intensity. "You think it accident that the Wolf of Endings would find its way to the one place in all the 9 realms where dwells a man whose very presence weakens the barriers between what is and what must be?" The implications of these words hit Jorik like a physical blow. His arrival at Skallavik, his peaceful years of exile, Fenris's appearance, none of it had been chance. He had been manipulated, guided, positioned like a piece on some cosmic game board. "Who sent you here?" he demanded. "Who arranged this?" But the creature was already moving, his form beginning to blur and fade around the edges. "The same ones who will come for you both when they learn of this night's failure. Enjoy your victory, Ashborn. It will be your last." The other 2 creatures began to fade as well, their forms dissolving into shadow and mist. But their leader had one final revelation to share. "The wolf you protect carries within him the power to unmake gods, and you, Jorik the Ashborn, carry within yourself the key to unleashing that power. Together, you are more dangerous than either could be alone." The creatures vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of corruption and the echo of mocking laughter. In the sudden silence, the 4 humans and 1 wolf looked at each other with a mixture of relief and growing dread. Fenris padded over to Jorik and pressed against his leg, but the gesture that had seemed purely animal before now carried weight and significance that made the giant's skin crawl. The wolf looked up at him with eyes that held far too much intelligence, too much ancient knowledge. "What have we done?" Magnus asked quietly, his hammer hanging forgotten at his side. Astrid closed the door and slid the bolt, though they all knew it would provide little protection against beings that could fade in and out of existence at will. "We've chosen a side," she said firmly. "The question now is whether it was the right one." Jorik knelt beside Fenris, studying the wolf's face for any sign of the cosmic threat the creatures had described. But all he saw was gratitude, loyalty, and a bone-deep weariness that matched his own. "They called you the Wolf of Endings," he said quietly. "Is that what you are?" Fenris tilted his head, and for just a moment, Jorik could have sworn he heard a voice that wasn't quite sound, wasn't quite thought. "I am what I choose to be. Just as you are." Outside, storm clouds were gathering with unnatural speed, and the wind carried the promise of changes that would reshape everything they thought they knew about their quiet world. Dawn broke grey and troubled over Skallavik, as if the sun itself was reluctant to witness what the new day might bring. Jorik had not slept, spending the long hours of darkness sitting beside Fenris in the storage room, watching the wolf's steady breathing and trying to reconcile what he had learned with what he had believed about his own life. The wolf appeared to be sleeping, but Jorik suspected that was merely an appearance. Occasionally, Fenris would open one yellow eye and regard him with an expression that seemed far too knowing for any earthly creature. The scars from his torture remained, but they had faded somewhat, as if the removal of the collar had allowed some natural healing process to accelerate. Astrid knocked softly before entering, carrying a tray with bread, cheese, and hot tea. Her face showed the strain of the night's events, but her hands were steady as she set the food down. "The settlement is talking," she reported quietly. "Word has spread about the strangers and their sudden departure. Some are calling it a blessing that they left so quickly. Others are wondering what they were really after." Jorik accepted a cup of tea gratefully, the warmth helping to chase away the chill that seemed to have settled in his bones. "What about Fenris? Are people still afraid?" "Opinions are divided. Eric has been telling anyone who will listen that you performed some kind of miracle, healing a sick animal through kindness. But Gunnar is spreading darker theories. As if summoned by his name, voices could be heard approaching the inn. Gunnar's booming tones carried clearly through the morning air, and he was not alone. Jorik recognized the voices of several other merchants and craftsmen, men whose opinions carried weight in the settlement's informal hierarchy. "I tell you, something unnatural happened here last night," Gunnar was saying. "Those strangers didn't leave, they vanished like smoke. And that wolf is no ordinary beast. Look at how it changed after Jorik touched it." "What are you suggesting?" "That was Olaf, the rope maker, a cautious man who rarely involved himself in disputes. I'm suggesting that we may have welcomed something dangerous into our midst. There are old stories about wolves and the end times. What if this creature is connected to those prophecies?" Astrid grimaced. "Gunnar always was too clever for his own good. He's putting pieces together that others might miss." The voices grew closer, and Jorik could hear at least a dozen different speakers now. The entire settlement seemed to be converging on the inn, drawn by curiosity and growing concern about the events of the previous night. Fenris opened both eyes and lifted his head, his ears pricked forward as he listened to the approaching crowd. The wolf's expression showed neither fear nor aggression, but something that might have been resignation. "They're afraid," Jorik observed, "and frightened people make poor decisions." Before Astrid could respond, heavy footsteps echoed through the inn, followed by a firm knock on the storage room door. Magnus's voice called out, "Jorik, you'd better come out here. There's a situation developing." Jorik looked down at Fenris. "Stay here. This is something I need to handle alone." But as he rose to leave, the wolf also stood, moving to follow him. When Jorik tried to gently push him back, Fenris resisted, his yellow eyes meeting the giant's with unmistakable determination. Together came that voice that was not quite sound, not quite thought. "We face this together." Jorik hesitated, then nodded. If the wolf of prophecy was willing to stand beside him, perhaps that said something about the nature of destiny itself. They emerged from the storage room to find the inn's common room packed with nearly 40 people, more than half of Skallavik's adult population. The crowd parted to create a clear path as Jorik and Fenris walked toward the center of the room, and the giant could feel the weight of every gaze upon them. Magnus stood near the main hearth, his smith's apron still stained with soot from the morning's work. Beside him, old Bjorn leaned heavily on his walking stick, his rheumy eyes fixed on Fenris with an expression of wonder and worry. Gunnar occupied a position near the front of the crowd, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Jorik," Gunnar began without preamble, "we need to discuss what happened here last night. The strangers who came looking for this wolf, they weren't natural. Several people saw them disappear into thin air." "That's true," Jorik replied calmly. "They were practitioners of dark magic, sorcerers who had been torturing this animal for their own purposes." A murmur ran through the crowd at this confirmation of their suspicions. Eric pushed forward from the back, his young face bright with excitement. "You drove them off," he exclaimed. "You and the wolf together. I saw the light from the collar when it broke. It was like watching the gods themselves work magic." "That's exactly what worries me," Gunnar interjected. "Magic of that magnitude doesn't happen by accident. What aren't you telling us about this wolf, Jorik? Old Bjorn stepped forward, his walking stick tapping against the wooden floor. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of age and wisdom that commanded attention even in a crowded room. I have lived 73 winters, he said slowly. In that time, I have heard many stories that were dismissed as myths by younger men. But last night, I saw things that make me wonder if some of those stories might be true after all. He looked directly at Fenris, who met his gaze without flinching. There are legends about a wolf that will one day herald the end of this age, a creature bound by the gods themselves because of what it was destined to become. Looking at this animal now, I see something that makes those old stories feel suddenly very real. The crowd's murmur grew louder, tinged now with fear. Several people moved closer to the exits, while others gripped whatever weapons they carried. The mood in the room was shifting toward panic, and Jorik knew he had only moments to prevent it from boiling over. "Yes," he said, his voice cutting through the growing noise like a sword through silk. "This is Fenris, the wolf of legend." The silence that followed was complete and profound. Even the children seemed to sense the weight of what had been revealed. "But," Jorik continued, "legends are not destiny. This wolf came here seeking sanctuary, just as I did 7 years ago. He has been tortured and tormented by those who would use him for their own dark purposes. Right now, he needs our help, not our fear." Gunnar's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "You've brought the herald of the end times to our settlement, and you want us to offer it sanctuary? Are you mad?" Fenris stepped forward, positioning himself slightly ahead of Jorik. When he spoke, everyone in the room could hear him, though his words seemed to bypass the ears entirely. "I am not your enemy," the wolf said, his mental voice carrying a weight of sorrow that made several people gasp. "I did not choose the prophecies that bind me. I seek only peace and the chance to determine my own path." The revelation that the wolf could communicate sent a new wave of shock through the crowd, but it was Astrid who spoke into the silence. 7 years ago, we welcomed a giant of a man who carried darkness in his past, but sought only to live quietly among us. He has been nothing but a blessing to this community. Perhaps we should judge this wolf by his actions, not by ancient prophecies. The debate that erupted then would rage for hours, dividing the settlement into camps and forcing each resident to choose between fear and compassion. The debate had raged through the afternoon and into the evening, with the settlement split nearly down the middle. Those who supported offering sanctuary to Fenris pointed to Jorik's 7 years of peaceful service and the wolf's obvious suffering at the hands of dark sorcerers. Those opposed spoke of ancient prophecies and the dangers of harboring a creature destined to bring about the end times. As night fell, the crowd had dispersed to their homes, but Jorik could feel the tension crackling through the settlement like lightning before a storm. Families argued across dinner tables, friendships strained under the weight of fundamental disagreements about good and evil, fate and free will. He was walking along the docks, seeking solitude and the calming influence of the dark water, when old Bjorn appeared beside him with surprising stealth for a man of his age. The old trader moved with careful steps on the wooden planks, but his voice was strong when he spoke. "Walk with me, Jorik. There are things you need to know before this situation spirals beyond anyone's control." They walked in silence for several minutes, their footsteps muffled by the mist that had begun to rise from the fjord. Bjorn led them to a small fishing boat moored at the end of the longest pier, where the sound of their voices would not carry back to the settlement. 73 winters, Bjorn said again, settling himself on a coil of rope with a grunt of effort, long enough to see patterns that younger men miss. Long enough to recognize when fate is moving pieces across the board of the world. Jorik remained standing, his eyes scanning the dark water for signs of approaching danger. The events of the previous night had left him with the uncomfortable feeling that they were being watched, hunted by forces more patient and persistent than the bone weavers who had fled. "You have something to tell me," Jorik said. "Something about why I'm really here." Bjorn nodded slowly. when a young trader like myself traveled to the far northern settlements seeking rare furs and amber. I found both, but I also found something else, a community that worshipped old gods and practiced older magics. The old man's voice grew distant, as if he were seeing scenes from long ago played out on the mist-shrouded water. They called themselves the Circle of the Endless Winter, and they claimed to serve powers that predated the coming of Christianity to these lands. Their leader was a woman named Sigrid the Bone Caller, and she spoke of prophecies that would reshape the world. Jorik felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The Bone Weavers mentioned serving someone. Was this Sigrid their master? Not their master, their creator. Sigrid was the one who developed the rituals that transformed living men into those grey-skinned creatures. She believed that by sacrificing their humanity, her followers could gain the power needed to prevent the fulfillment of certain prophecies. Bjorn reached into his traveling pouch and withdrew an object wrapped in oiled leather. When he unwrapped it, Jorik saw a pendant of black iron worked with intricate designs that matched those he had seen on Fenris's collar. "She gave this to me as payment for information," Bjorn continued. "Information about the movements of certain individuals whose bloodlines and destinies made them important to her plans." The implications struck Jorik like a physical blow. "You've been watching me, reporting on me. For 40 years, I have sent messages north describing the comings and goings of significant people in this region, warriors with particular skills, scholars with dangerous knowledge, and descendants of bloodlines that figure in the old prophecies." Jorik's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt. "Bloodlines? What bloodline?" Bjorn's weathered face creased with something that might have been regret or relief. "You are descended from Tyr, Jorik, the god who lost his hand binding Fenris in the first place. Your ancestor was the only one brave enough to place his hand in the wolf's mouth as surety for the god's promise." The world seemed to tilt around Jorik as memories flooded back childhood dreams of a one-handed figure teaching him to fight, a birthmark on his own right hand that matched the scars described in ancient stories, the way weapons seemed to sing in his grip as if recognizing something in his blood. "That's why you could break the collar's hold on Fenris," Bjorn continued. "Why your presence weakened the magical bonds. The blood of Tyr carries within it the power to bind or free the wolf of endings. It was always meant to be your choice." Fenris materialized out of the mist as if summoned by the revelation, his yellow eyes reflecting starlight as he padded silently across the pier. The wolf moved directly to Jorik and sat beside him, close enough that the giant could feel the warmth radiating from his fur. "You knew," Jorik said, looking down at the wolf. "When you first saw me, you knew what I was. I smelled the god blood in your veins." Fenris replied, his mental voice heavy with ancient memory. "But more than that, I smelled kindness. Choice matters more than destiny, and you chose to help me when others would not." Bjorn shifted uncomfortably on his makeshift seat. "There's more. Sigrid didn't just want information about your movements, she wanted you brought to her. She believes that by controlling both you and Fenris, she can prevent Ragnarok entirely, or perhaps trigger it on her own terms. And you've been working toward that goal for 40 years. Jorik's voice was dangerously quiet. "I thought I was," Bjorn admitted. "But watching you these past 7 years, seeing the man you've become, the peace you've found, I began to question whether preventing the end times was worth the price Sigrid was willing to pay." The old trader struggled to his feet, his joints protesting after the long conversation. "Last night, when I saw you risk everything to help a wounded animal, I made my choice. I sent my final message to Sigrid 3 days ago, telling her you had died of a fever. As far as she knows, the god blood line has ended." Jorik stared at the pendant in Bjorn's hands, understanding that it represented 40 years of deception and manipulation. But he also saw in the old man's eyes something he recognized, the desire to make amends for past choices. "Why tell me this now?" because Sigrid is not the only one who seeks to control the prophesied time. There are others, gods and monsters, both who have their own plans for you and Fenris. The Bone Weaver's failure will not go unnoticed, and more will come. You need to know what you truly are if you're going to protect what matters to you. Fenris raised his head, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent on the evening breeze. Speaking of which, the wolf said grimly, we may have visitors sooner than expected. From the direction of the settlement came the sound of horses approaching at speed, many horses, their hoofbeats creating a rhythmic thunder that spoke of military discipline and urgent purpose. But there was something else beneath the sound, a resonance that made the pier itself vibrate sympathetically. Cavalry? Jorik wondered aloud. No, Bjorn whispered, his face gone pale in the starlight. Much worse. Those are the hoofbeats of the Einherjar, the honored dead who serve in Odin's hall. The wild hunt had come to Skallavik, and at its head rode the All-Father himself, seeking answers about why his greatest enemy had been freed from bonds that were supposed to hold until the end of the world. As the otherworldly riders crested the hill above the settlement, their armor gleaming with cold fire and their mounts breathing frost instead of steam, Jorik realized that the quiet life he had built was about to end forever. The gods themselves were taking notice of what had transpired, and gods, unlike men, did not forgive or forget. Fenris pressed closer against his leg, and together they watched the beginning of something that would either save the world or destroy it entirely. The wild hunt descended upon Skallavik like a storm given form and purpose. 20 riders on horses that seemed carved from shadow and starlight, their hoofbeats creating music that resonated in the bones of every living thing within leagues. At their head rode a figure that needed no introduction, tall and terrible in his dark cloak, his wide-brimmed hat casting shadows that seemed deeper than the night itself. Odin the All-Father had come calling, and his single remaining eye blazed with the cold fire of divine anger. The settlement's residents poured from their homes despite the late hour, drawn by a compulsion that spoke to something primal in human nature, the need to witness when gods walked among mortals. But they kept their distance, forming a loose circle around the trading post's main courtyard as the otherworldly riders arranged themselves in perfect formation. Jorik stood in the center of that courtyard with Fenris at his side, old Bjorn having positioned himself slightly behind them both. The giant felt the weight of divine attention like a physical force pressing down upon his shoulders, but he kept his back straight and his hand away from his sword. Whatever was about to happen, starting it with violence would serve no one. Odin dismounted from his 8-legged steed with fluid grace that belied his apparent age. Up close, the god was both more and less than the stories suggested, tall, but not impossibly so, bearded and weathered like any wandering warrior, but carrying about him an aura of power that made the air itself seem thick and difficult to breathe. Jorik, son of Tyr, the All-Father spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite being barely above a whisper. I had heard rumors of your survival, but seeing you here confirms what I feared most. The god's single eye moved to Fenris, who had not moved from Jorik's side, but whose yellow gaze met the divine stare without flinching. And you, Fenris Lokison, still wearing the shape we bound you in, I see. How considerate of you not to reveal your true form to these mortals. Fenris's mental voice carried to everyone present, mortal and divine alike. I am what I choose to be. Skyfather. No more, no less. Odin laughed, a sound like winter wind through bare branches. Choice. How refreshingly naive. Do you know why we bound you, wolf? Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The prophecies are clear about what you will do when the twilight of the gods arrives. Prophecies speak of what may be, not what must be. Jorik interjected, stepping slightly forward. Free will exists even for gods and monsters. The All-Father turned his attention back to Jorik, and the giant felt the god's gaze penetrating layers of thought and memory, examining the very essence of his being. Your father believed that once. It cost him his hand and, eventually, his life. Will you make the same mistake? From the assembled crowd, Astrid's voice rang out clear and strong. Jorik has lived among us for 7 years in peace. He has harmed no one and helped many. Why should his bloodline matter more than his choices? Odin's head turned toward her, and Astrid visibly paled under the weight of divine attention, but she did not step back or lower her eyes. Mortal woman, you speak of things beyond your understanding. The blood of gods carries responsibilities that transcend individual desire. Magnus appeared beside Astrid, his smith's hammer held loose at his side. With respect, All-Father, we've seen what happens when people try to control others through force. It breeds nothing but suffering. More residents began to step forward. Eric, with his young face set in determined lines, several of the other merchants and craftsmen, even some of those who had argued against harboring Fenris. They formed a protective semicircle around Jorik and the wolf, their faces showing fear but also resolution. Odin observed this display with something that might have been surprise. Remarkable. Mortals willing to stand against gods for the sake of one they consider friend. Your father would be proud. The god walked closer, close enough that Jorik could see the ancient weariness in that single eye, the weight of knowledge and responsibility that had carved lines in the divine face. But pride will not change what must come to pass. Ragnarok approaches, whether we will it or not. The only question is whether it will unfold according to prophecy or be shaped by those with the power to influence its course. Fenris rose to his feet, his form seeming to shimmer and grow larger for a moment, before settling back to his normal size. You speak of what must come to pass, but you forget prophecy is often self-fulfilling. By binding me, by torturing me, by hunting me, you create the very hatred and desperation that will drive me to fulfill those dark predictions. And what would you have me do? Odin demanded. Allow you to run free, knowing what you are destined to become, knowing that your freedom could mean the death of everything I have worked to protect? Trust, Jorik said simply. Trust that given the chance, most beings will choose light over darkness, healing over destruction. The All-Father's laugh was bitter now. Trust? I trusted once. I trusted Loki, and that trust gave birth to you, Wolf. I trusted my own wisdom, and that led to schemes and manipulations that caused more suffering than they prevented. Old Bjorn stepped forward, his walking stick clicking against the stone courtyard. I have spent 40 years serving someone who claimed to act in the greater good, reporting on this man's movements because I believed it would help prevent catastrophe. But watching him these past 7 years taught me that good intentions without wisdom become their own form of evil. Odin's eye fixed on the old trader. Bjorn Ironsson. Yes, we know of your service to Sigrid the Bonecaller. Did you truly believe she sought to prevent Ragnarok, or did you simply find it easier not to question her methods? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Bjorn's shoulders sagged under its weight. Both, I fear. It is easier to follow orders than to make hard choices. Indeed it is, Odin agreed. And yet here you stand, having made such a choice. Interesting. The god began to pace slowly around Jorik and Fenris, his movements predatory despite their measured pace. Sigrid believes she can control the prophesied time by binding those who feature in it. Others believe they can prevent it through preparation and vigilance. But you, descendant of Tyr, you believe in something even more dangerous, redemption. I believe in second chances, Jorik corrected. I believe that what we do matters more than what we are destined to do. Even if that belief endangers everything you claim to protect? Jorik looked around at the faces of the people who had become his family over 7 years of quiet life. Astrid with her practical strength, Magnus with his honest craftsmanship, Eric with his young enthusiasm. Even Gunnar, who had argued against harbouring Fenris, but now stood with his neighbours. These people had accepted him despite his dark past, had given him a place to belong when he had thought such things were beyond his reach. Especially then, he said firmly, fear of what might happen should never prevent us from doing what we know is right. Odin stopped pacing and faced him directly. Then, you will not surrender the wolf to my keeping, will not accept the bonds I offer to place upon your own divine blood. No. The single word fell into silence that seemed to stretch across eternity. Around the courtyard, the Einherjar shifted in their saddles, hands moving to weapons that could unmake the souls of mortals with a single strike. The temperature dropped noticeably, frost beginning to form on surfaces despite the mild autumn weather. Then you have chosen war with the gods themselves, Odin said sadly. And you have chosen it not just for yourself, but for all who stand with you. Fenris padded forward to stand directly between Jorik and the All-Father. I will not allow harm to come to those who showed me kindness. If you wish to reclaim me, Skyfather, you will have to go through them. And you will have to go through me, Jorik added, his hand finally moving to rest on his sword hilt. One by one, the residents of Skallavik stepped forward to join them. Astrid with her iron poker, Magnus with his hammer, Eric with a fishing spear, and dozens of others with whatever weapons they could find. They were farmers and traders, craftsmen and innkeepers, facing down the king of gods with nothing but courage and stubborn loyalty. Odin looked upon this sight with an expression that mixed admiration with sorrow. So be it. But know this, when Sigrid comes with her full power, when the forces she has gathered descend upon this place, your courage alone will not be enough to protect what you hold dear. The god remounted his 8-legged horse and raised his spear high. I give you 3 days to reconsider. After that, the choice will be taken from all of us. The wild hunt wheeled as one and rode back into the darkness, their hoofbeats fading until only the memory of divine music remained. In their wake, they left a settlement that had been forever changed. Ordinary people who had looked gods in the eye and chosen love over fear, loyalty over safety. But they also left behind the certain knowledge that war was coming and that the next battle would determine not just the fate of Skallavik, but the destiny of the 9 realms themselves. The 3 days passed like the calm before a hurricane, filled with frantic preparation and growing dread. Skallavik had transformed from a peaceful trading post into something resembling a military camp, though its defenders were farmers and merchants rather than warriors. Under Jorik's guidance, they had done what they could to fortify the settlement, reinforcing buildings, gathering weapons, and creating escape routes for the children and elderly. But everyone knew that conventional defenses would mean little against the forces that were coming. On the morning of the 4th day, the sky darkened despite the early hour. Storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, swirling in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow directly. The wind carried strange scents, sulphur and burnt iron, old blood and older magic. Even the seabirds fled inland, their cries echoing across empty water. Fenris stood atop the highest building in the settlement, his yellow eyes scanning the horizon. His form had continued to change over the past 3 days, growing larger and more imposing, though he maintained careful control over the transformation. The wolf that had limped into Skallavik seeking sanctuary was gone, replaced by something that clearly belonged to legend and prophecy. They come from the north, Fenris announced, his mental voice reaching every person in the settlement. Ships that sail through mist and shadow, carrying the bone caller and her transformed servants. Jorik climbed to join him on the rooftop, his own transformation less visible, but no less significant. The divine blood in his veins had awakened fully during the confrontation with Odin, and he could feel power humming beneath his skin like lightning, waiting to be unleashed. His right hand, marked with the god sign of Tyr, glowed with a faint golden radiance. "How many?" he asked. 50. Perhaps more. And they are not alone. Sigrid has made pacts with things that should not walk in daylight. As if summoned by his words, shapes began to emerge from the unnatural fog that had settled over the fjord. Ships with black sails and hulls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their crews moved with the jerky, unnatural motions of the long dead, and at their prows stood figures wreathed in shadow and malice. From the largest vessel, a woman's voice carried across the water with supernatural clarity. "Jorik of the Godblood, I have come to claim what was promised to me 40 years ago. Surrender yourself and the wolf, and your people will be spared." Astrid appeared at Jorik's shoulder, her face grim but determined. "The children and elderly are hidden in the old mines, as you suggested. The rest of us are ready to fight, though I'll admit I'm not sure what good kitchen knives will do against dark magic." "More than you might think," Jorik replied, drawing his sword. The blade sang as it cleared the scabbard, its steel now gleaming with the same golden light that marked his hand. "Iron forged with honest purpose has its own power against corruption." The ships reached the docks with impossible speed, and their crews poured onto the wooden planks like a tide of nightmare. Bone weavers moved among reanimated corpses, their grey skin marked with fresh ritual scars that wept black blood. Behind them came things that might once have been wolves or bears, now twisted into shapes that violated the natural order. At their head walked Sigrid the Bone-caller herself, and the sight of her made even Fenris bare his teeth in involuntary fear. She had been beautiful once, but decades of dark magic had transformed her into something that existed at the border between life and death. Her skin was paper white, stretched too tight over bones that had been rearranged for purposes beyond human understanding. Her eyes were holes in reality itself, windows into a void that consumed light and hope with equal hunger. 40 years I have waited," she called out, her voice carrying the chill of the grave. 40 years of careful planning, of positioning pieces on the board of fate. And now the final game begins. She raised a staff topped with a skull that still held traces of divine power, and the very air around her began to crack and bleed. Where her feet touched the wooden dock, frost spread in intricate patterns that formed binding runes of immense complexity. "Jorik the Ashborn, last son of Tyr's line, come forward and accept the chains I have forged for you, or watch everything you claim to protect burn in the fires of my displeasure." Jorik felt the compulsion in her words, magic designed to override will and force obedience. But the god blood in his veins burned brighter, forming a barrier against her influence. Beside him, Fenris growled low in his throat, his form beginning to ripple and expand. "I think not," Jorik called back, his own voice carrying new harmonics of power. "You've made the same mistake as all who seek to control others. You assume they cannot choose to resist." Around them, the defenders of Skallavik emerged from their positions. Magnus wielded a hammer that glowed with forge fire, while Astrid carried a blade, blessed by every protective prayer she knew. Eric stood with a spear that trembled with barely contained energy, and dozens of others took their places in a formation that spoke of desperate courage rather than military training. "Then let the final battle begin." Sigrid laughed, and the sound shattered windows throughout the settlement. The battle erupted with the fury of colliding storms. Sigrid's creatures charged forward in a wave of corruption and death, their inhuman shrieks echoing off the settlement's buildings. The defenders of Skallavik met them at the docks, and what should have been a massacre became something else, entirely a testament to the power of ordinary people fighting for what they loved. Magnus's hammer struck down a bone weaver with a blow that sent golden sparks cascading through the air. Astrid moved with deadly precision, her blessed blade carving through animated corpses that fell and did not rise again. Eric's spear found its mark in a twisted wolf thing, and the young man's courage inspired others to press forward despite their fear. But it was Jorik and Fenris who truly turned the tide. The giant moved like a force of nature, his god-blessed sword cutting through dark magic as easily as it did corrupted flesh. Where he struck, golden light followed, cleansing the taint that had twisted Sigrid's servants. The divine blood in his veins sang with each blow, and he felt his father's strength flowing through him across the centuries. Beside him, Fenris had abandoned all pretense of being merely a large wolf. His true form stood revealed, massive beyond mortal comprehension, with eyes like burning stars and fangs that could bite through the chains of fate itself. When he howled, the sound shattered the binding spells that held Sigrid's army together, and several of the reanimated corpses simply collapsed back into death. Sigrid watched the destruction of her forces with growing fury, her void dark eyes fixed on the two figures cutting through her carefully crafted army. "Enough," she snarled, raising her skull-topped staff high above her head. "If these fools will not submit, then they will burn." Power erupted from the staff in a wave of black fire that should have incinerated everything in its path, but Jorik was ready for it, his sword blazing like a star as he called upon the full might of his divine heritage. The golden light met the dark magic in the space between them, and the resulting explosion shook the very foundations of the settlement. When the light faded, both combatants still stood, though the dock between them had been reduced to splinters and ash. Sigrid's beautiful mask of control had finally slipped, revealing the desperate madness beneath. "You think you can change fate?" she screamed. "You think your small acts of kindness matter against the weight of destiny? I have seen the end times, god blood. I have walked through the ruins of Asgard and watched the wolves feast on divine flesh." "Then you've seen only one possible future," Jorik replied, advancing steadily despite the waves of malevolent power radiating from her staff. "And I choose to believe in another." Sigrid's laugh was the sound of hope dying. "Choose? You still believe in choice? Look around you, fool. Look at what your choices have wrought." For a moment, doubt crept into Jorik's heart as he saw the bodies of fallen defenders, good people who had died because of his decisions. Magnus clutched a bleeding arm but continued to fight. Astrid's face was streaked with tears and soot. Eric limped on an injured leg but refused to retreat. But then Fenris's voice echoed in his mind, calm and certain despite the chaos around them. "They chose this, Jorik, not because you forced them, but because they believed it was right. That is the difference between us and her." The wolf god bounded forward, his massive form moving with impossible grace. Sigrid turned to meet him, her staff crackling with power. But Fenris was no longer the tortured creature she had helped to bind and break. He was legend incarnate, prophecy given form, and the sight of him in his full glory made even the bone-caller hesitate. "You sought to control me through pain," Fenris said, his mental voice echoing across the battlefield. "But pain only has power when it stands alone. These people showed me kindness without asking for anything in return. They gave me what you could never understand, a reason to choose light over darkness." Sigrid struck with all her accumulated power, 40 years of dark magic focused into a single devastating blow. But Jorik was there, his sword intercepting the attack, divine light meeting corrupted sorcery in a clash that lit up the sky like a second sun. In that moment of perfect balance, when light and darkness hung in equilibrium, something unexpected happened. The people of Skallavik, battered and bloodied but unbroken, began to sing. It was an old song, one their grandmothers had taught them about hope persisting through the longest winter. Their voices rose together, mortal and fragile, but carrying something that all the dark magic in the world could not touch, the simple faith that tomorrow could be better than today. The song broke Sigrid's concentration, and in that instant of vulnerability, Jorik's blade found its mark. Golden light poured through the wound, not destroying her body, but burning away the corruption that had consumed her soul. For just a moment, her void dark eyes cleared, and she looked upon what she had become with horror and recognition. "What have I done?" she whispered, and then she was gone, dissolved into motes of light that drifted away on the morning breeze. The silence that followed Sigrid's dissolution was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the damaged docks and the soft groans of the wounded. The dark ships had vanished with their master's death, leaving behind only empty water and the memory of a battle that had changed everything. Jorik stood amid the wreckage of what had been Skallavik's peaceful courtyard, his sword still glowing with fading divine light. The god blood in his veins had quieted to a gentle warmth, no longer the raging torrent of power it had been during the fight. Around him, the defenders of the settlement slowly emerged from their defensive positions, looking dazed but triumphant. Fenris had resumed his normal wolf form, though something in his bearing remained different, more regal, more aware. He padded over to where young Eric sat, clutching his injured leg, and the wolf's gentle touch somehow eased the pain that mortal healing could not reach. "Is it over?" Eric asked, his voice small in the aftermath of such cosmic violence. "This part is," Jorik replied, helping the young man to his feet. "But endings and beginnings are often the same thing, seen from different angles." Astrid appeared at his elbow, her practical nature already asserting itself as she surveyed the damage. "We'll need to rebuild the docks, repair the buildings, tend the wounded. Normal work for normal people." But even as she spoke, they all knew that nothing would ever be quite normal again. The people of Skallavik had looked gods and monsters in the face and made their choice. They had stood against powers that could unmake the world, and they had won not through superior force, but through something far more powerful, the simple conviction that kindness mattered more than destiny. Magnus limped over, his hammer still smoking with forge fire magic. "What happens now? To you, I mean, and to Fenris. Will you stay?" It was the question Jorik had been asking himself since the moment Sigrid's army appeared on the horizon. The quiet life he had built here had been shattered, replaced by something larger and more dangerous. He was no longer just a man seeking peace, he was the last scion of divine blood, bonded to a creature of legend and prophecy. But as he looked around at the faces of people who had become his family, he saw that they were asking not out of fear, but out of hope. They wanted him to stay, not because they needed protection, but because he belonged here. "If you'll have us," he said simply. Old Bjorn, who had fought with surprising vigor for a man of his years, chuckled as he picked his way through the debris. "I suspect we'll need some time to get used to having legend walking among us again. But yes, I think we can manage." In the days that followed, word of the battle spread throughout the northern settlements. Some told it as a tale of mortal courage triumphing over dark magic. Others spoke of the return of the old gods and the awakening of powers long dormant. But the version that resonated most strongly was simpler and more profound, the story of a community that chose love over fear, and how that choice changed everything. Visitors came to Skallavik, some seeking trade, others hoping to glimpse the legendary wolf or the god-blooded man who had defied fate itself. Most were disappointed to find ordinary people going about ordinary business, repairing nets, haggling over prices, arguing about whose turn it was to muck out the stables. Jorik resumed his quiet work around the settlement, though now people sought his counsel on matters both practical and profound. He found that the divine blood that had once felt like a burden now enabled him to offer wisdom that went beyond mere human experience. But he was careful never to let that wisdom become authority, always presenting his thoughts as suggestions rather than commands. Fenris became something of a village mascot, beloved by children who had quickly gotten used to having a wolf of legend as a playmate. He seemed to enjoy the role, often allowing himself to be decorated with flower crowns or serving as a mount for the smallest children. But sometimes in the evening hours, Jorik would catch glimpses of the creature's true nature, ancient eyes that held the weight of prophecy and the promise of things yet to come. 3 months after the battle, as autumn began to give way to winter, Odin returned to Skallavik. But this time he came alone, riding not at the head of the wild hunt, but as a simple traveller seeking shelter from the cold. He found Jorik and Fenris sitting by the fire in Astrid's common room, playing a board game that the wolf was winning through what appeared to be supernatural intuition about his opponent's strategies. "Well," the All-Father said, settling onto a bench with the weary sigh of any old man seeking warmth, "this is not how I expected things to unfold." "Prophecy rarely unfolds as expected," Fenris replied, without looking up from the game board. "That's what makes choice meaningful." Odin accepted a cup of ale from Astrid with a nod of thanks. "I came to see what you had built here, in defiance of fate and divine will. I expected to find chaos, corruption, the beginning of the end times, and instead," Jorik prompted, "instead I find a trading post where legends help repair fishing nets and gods play board games by the fire." Odin shook his head in something that might have been wonder. "Perhaps there are forms of wisdom that even the All-Father has yet to learn." As winter settled over Skallavik, the settlement entered a new chapter of its existence. They were still traders and craftsmen, farmers and fishermen, but they were also the people who had proven that destiny was not fixed, that even the darkest prophecies could be rewritten by those brave enough to choose hope over fear. And in the quiet moments between busy days, when Jorik walked the docks with Fenris at his side and watched the sun set over water that reflected peace rather than violence, he understood that this was what redemption truly looked like, not a single dramatic moment of choice, but the daily decision to build something better than what came before. The wolf of endings had become the wolf of new beginnings, and the god blood that had once seemed like a curse had become the foundation of a different kind of legend entirely.